The message came through at 5:32 in the morning, and it said nothing useful. That was the last message Lieutenant Colonel Dean Donahue received from regimental headquarters before the radios went silent. Not jammed, not destroyed, simply silent. Somewhere to the north, somewhere to the south, the lines had ceased to exist, and with them the voice of any authority that could tell him what to do next. He was standing in a farmhouse in the Belgian forest, with a hand-pressed receiver against his ear, listening to static, while outside in the dark something enormous was moving through the trees. This is a story about what happens in the space between the last order and the next one. That space, in most wars, lasts minutes. In the Ardennes, in December 1944, it lasted days. And for the men inside it, it lasted a lifetime. The Germans had chosen fog as their accomplice, not metaphorical fog, actual fog, thick and gray and absolute, the kind that rolls in off the Eifel highlands and sits in the river valleys like something alive, the kind that turned the forests into rooms with no walls and no ceiling and no floor you could trust. The Allies owned the sky everywhere in Europe in December 1944. Everywhere, that is, except where the fog was. And the fog was in the Ardennes. They had been planning it for months in basements and bunkers, while the Allied armies pushed toward the Rhine, and the newspapers printed stories about the war being over by Christmas. They had assembled 200,000 men and 600 tanks in near-perfect secrecy, moving only at night, banning radio traffic, pulling fuel from reserves that German commanders on other fronts needed desperately and would never see again. They called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a name chosen to suggest a defensive redeployment to any Allied intelligence analyst who might intercept a fragment of it. It was the last major strategic gamble of a nation that had run out of everything except the capacity to surprise. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, 2,000 German artillery pieces fired simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The men sleeping in foxholes in the Ardennes had no warning. Not because Allied intelligence had failed entirely. Fragments had reached higher headquarters, whispers of unusual German movement, prisoners who spoke of something coming. But because the assessments that shaped command decisions had already decided the Ardennes was quiet, and once an assessment hardens into institutional certainty, the fragments that contradict it tend to disappear. The front had been designated a rest sector. Fresh divisions were there to learn. Battered divisions were there to heal. Nobody was there to stop what was coming, because what was coming had been ruled impossible. And then the shells started falling, and the impossible walked out of the forest. The Ardennes in December 1944 was not supposed to be where the war almost broke apart, because by that point in the conflict, the momentum had shifted so decisively in the Allies' favor that the question being discussed in Allied headquarters was not whether Germany would be defeated, but how quickly and through which route. And the front in the Ardennes had been designated a quiet sector, a rest area where exhausted divisions could be rotated in to recover from the fighting further north and south, manned with a relatively thin deployment of forces because the terrain was considered too difficult for any serious German offensive operation, thick forests and narrow roads, and winter conditions that military planners on both sides had historically treated as a natural barrier against large-scale armored movement. And the American units holding that sector reflected the assessment that nothing serious was going to happen there. Some of them were fresh divisions that had just arrived in theater and had never seen combat. Others were veteran units that had been badly chewed up elsewhere and needed time to rebuild their strength before going back into the line. And the men in those positions were cold and tired and focused on surviving the winter, rather than on the possibility that the Germans were assembling the largest offensive operation they had mounted in the West since 1940, in the forests directly across from them. And when that offensive came on the morning of December 16th, it came with a weight and a violence and a completeness of surprise that the American units in its path had no framework to process, because nothing in their recent experience had prepared them for what a concentrated German armored assault with full artillery preparation and complete tactical surprise felt like when it hit a thinly held defensive line in the dark and the fog and the snow. And units that had been holding positions the previous evening found themselves fighting in multiple directions simultaneously, with communications cut and neighboring units unreachable, and the tactical picture dissolving so completely that the fundamental question of where the front line actually was became unanswerable within the first hours of the attack. And what made the situation worse was that the fog that grounded Allied air power in those first days also grounded Allied reconnaissance, so that the higher headquarters trying to understand what was happening on the front had almost no reliable information about the scale of what they were facing. And orders that went down the chain of command in the first hours of the offensive were based on assessments that were already obsolete by the time they were written, because the situation on the ground was moving faster than any communication system available could track. And it was into this environment of collapsing information and dissolving front lines and units fighting in isolation from any coherent picture of the larger battle that the story of one American battalion and its commanding officer begins. A story about what happens when the structure that military units depend on to function collapses entirely and leaves a commander with nothing except the men immediately around him, and whatever combination of training and judgment and sheer stubbornness he brought to a situation that had no good options and several catastrophic ones. And the battalion that found itself surrounded and cut off in those first days of the German offensive was not an exceptional unit in any way that would have distinguished it before the battle. It was a standard American infantry battalion with the normal complement of weapons and equipment and the normal range of experience among its men, from the very green to the moderately seasoned. And its commanding officer was the kind of officer that the American Army produced in large numbers during the war, competent and professional, and shaped by the training and the doctrine that had prepared him for conventional operations in a relatively stable tactical environment. And nothing in that preparation had specifically addressed the question of what to do when your battalion is surrounded. Your communications with higher headquarters are cut. You have no clear picture of where the German forces are, or how many of them there are, or what their intentions toward your position specifically might be. Your ammunition and food and medical supplies are finite, and getting more finite with every hour that passes. Your wounded need treatment that your medical resources can only partially provide, and the decision you make in the next few hours will determine whether any of the several hundred men around you are going to be alive in a week. And the weight of that decision, the specific and unshared weight of command in a situation where every outcome flows from what one person decides in conditions of radical uncertainty, is the thing that the after-action reports and the official communicating those decisions to the men who needed to execute them, not pretending that the situation was better than it was, but also not allowing the weight of the situation to transmit itself through his behavior to the men around him in a way that would have degraded their ability to function. The relief of the encircled battalion when it finally came was not the clean, dramatic rescue that the narrative shape of the story might seem to require, because the operations to restore the situation in the Ardennes were themselves conducted under conditions of extreme difficulty and against German resistance that was determined and professional, and that understood perfectly well that the encirclements it was maintaining were among the most valuable tactical assets it held in those first days of the offensive, because surrounded American units that were fighting to survive were units that were not contributing to the Allied response to the offensive, and every day an encircled battalion spent inside its perimeter was a day that the German offensive retained the initiative, and so the German forces surrounding the battalion were not passive watchers waiting for the Americans to attempt a breakout. They were active defenders of the encirclement itself, probing the perimeter to keep the Americans occupied and reinforcing the blocking positions that prevented relief forces from reaching the surrounded units and positioning themselves to make any relief operation as costly as possible, and the American forces pushing to restore contact with the surrounded battalion had to fight through exactly these prepared positions across terrain that favored the defender, and in weather that remained brutal throughout the operation, and the men doing the fighting to break through to the surrounded battalion were themselves operating under the strain of continuous combat in winter conditions, with the particular urgency that comes from knowing that the people you are fighting toward are running out of time. And when contact was finally made, and the corridor was opened, and the first elements of the relieving force reached the battalion perimeter, the condition of the men inside was the condition of soldiers who had been through something that tested every resource they had brought to it, physically depleted by days of cold and reduced rations and sustained stress, but functionally intact in the way that units with strong leadership and genuine cohesion remain intact under conditions that destroy units without those things. And the commanding officer's account of the experience, the decisions made, and the reasoning behind them, and the moments where different decisions might have produced different outcomes, is one of the more valuable documents to emerge from the American experience in the Battle of the Bulge, because it is honest in a way that official histories rarely are, honest about what worked and what didn't, and what was decided wrong, and what the experience actually cost the men who went through it, and what emerges from that account and from the broader story of American units that were encircled in the opening days of the German offensive is a picture of an army that had been fundamentally changed by 2 years of continuous combat into something qualitatively different from the force that had first arrived in theater. An army that could absorb the shock of encirclement at the unit level and reorganize and hold and wait and survive. Not because its soldiers were individually exceptional, but because the combination of training and experience and leadership that the Army had developed through 2 years of fighting had produced units with the institutional resilience to function when the framework around them collapsed, and the German planners who designed the Ardennes offensive had not fully accounted for this quality, because the model of American military performance they were working from was drawn from earlier in the war, when the Army was newer and less experienced, and when encirclement and isolation had produced outcomes more favorable to the attacker, and by December 1944, that model was out of date, and the battalions that held their perimeters in the Ardennes through those first brutal days of the offensive were the proof that it was out of date, proof written in the cold and the dark and the finite. Ammunition and the wounded in the aid stations and the commanding officers making decisions alone with nothing but their judgment and their men and their refusal to let the situation decide how the story ended. Histories can describe, but cannot fully convey. What the commanding officer did when he understood the full dimensions of the situation his battalion was in is worth examining in detail, because the decisions he made in those first hours established the pattern that would determine everything that followed. And the first and in many ways most important decision was the decision not to attempt an immediate breakout, which was the instinctive response that the tactical situation seemed to demand, and which would almost certainly have destroyed the battalion if he had acted on it, because a breakout attempt requires knowing where to break out toward, requires having enough combat power to fight through whatever is blocking your route, requires making that attempt before the forces surrounding you have had time to consolidate their positions and prepare for exactly the contingency of their encircled enemy trying to fight its way out. And he had none of those conditions in the first hours after the encirclement, because the fog of battle that had descended on the Ardennes in those first days was as complete as any experienced in the entire European campaign, and moving a battalion through forests in winter, in the dark, without knowing where the German units were, was not a breakout attempt. It was a movement to destruction. And the German commanders who had planned the encirclement had planned for exactly the possibility of an immediate breakout and had positioned forces to intercept it. So the instinctive response was also the tactically wrong response, and the commanding officer understood this and made the harder decision, which was to stay. And the organizing he did in those first hours. After that decision is a model of what military leadership looks like when the external supports of command have been stripped away and a leader is left with nothing but his own judgment and the quality of the men around him. He established a perimeter using the terrain as intelligently as the terrain allowed. He consolidated his ammunition and supplies and put them under central control so that nothing was wasted and everything was allocated to where it was most needed rather than consumed unevenly. In the way that happens when units are managing their own resources under stress, he set up a medical collection point for his wounded and put his medical personnel to work. With whatever materials were available under whatever protection the perimeter could provide, he sent out small patrols, not to fight, but to look, to develop the situation around the perimeter and bring back information about German positions that would allow him to make better decisions than he could make operating blind. And he spoke to his officers and his senior non-commissioned officers with a directness about the situation that the circumstances required, not minimizing what they were facing, because minimizing it would have produced a false sense of security that the reality of the next few days would have destroyed, along with whatever trust the men had placed in the assessment, but not catastrophizing it either, because catastrophizing produces paralysis, and the one thing the battalion could not afford was paralysis. and he was clear about what was expected, which was that the battalion was going to hold its position and maintain its cohesion and manage its resources carefully and wait for the situation to change in a way that created options. Because the American Army was coming back, it always came back, and the only question was whether the battalion could hold long enough for that to happen. And the men responded to this leadership with the steady, functional competence that soldiers demonstrate when they have been given honest information and a clear task, and a reason to believe that performing the task has a purpose, not enthusiasm. Because enthusiasm was not what the situation called for, but the kind of disciplined professionalism that is in many ways more valuable than enthusiasm, because it sustains itself across days rather than hours. And the days inside the perimeter were days of cold and short rations, and the constant low-level tension of a defensive position that could be probed or attacked at any moment. Days where the sound of German vehicles moving in the forests beyond the perimeter was a reminder of the scale of the forces that had surrounded them and of the distance between their situation and anything that could be described as safe. And the medical situation inside the perimeter deteriorated as the days passed because the supply of materials was finite and the number of wounded was not finite, and the decisions about how to allocate what was available were the kind of decisions that leave marks on the people who make them, regardless of how correctly they are made. And through all of this, the commanding officer maintained the consistency of leadership that the battalion needed, present and visible, and making decisions and